The world before America, long before the idea of nations, long before borders were drawn by human hands, the land that would one day be called America existed as a vast, breathing world of ice, water, forests, and silence. The earth itself was different then. The climate was colder, harsher, and unforgiving. Massive glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere, grinding mountains into dust and reshaping continents with slow, unstoppable force. Oceans were lower, coastlines stretched farther, and lands now drowned beneath the sea stood exposed to the sky. In this ancient age, survival was not a philosophy or a choice, it was the only law that governed existence. During this time, a wide expanse of land connected two continents that modern humans would later call Asia and North America. This land bridge, known to science as Beringia, was not a narrow path but a massive region of tundra, grasslands, and frozen rivers. It was cold, windswept, and brutal, yet full of life. Mammoths roamed in herds, shaggy and immense. Bison thundered across open plains. Predators stalked silently through the snow. It was into this world that early humans stepped, not as conquerors, but as wanderers driven by hunger, instinct, and hope. These early humans did not know they were crossing into a new continent. They did not know they were beginning a story that would last tens of thousands of years. They followed animals because animals meant food, clothing, tools, and survival. Families moved together in small groups, carrying children on their backs, elders walking slowly behind, and hunters scanning the horizon for danger. Every decision mattered. A wrong step could mean death from cold, starvation, or predators. Knowledge was precious, passed orally from generation to generation: where to find shelter, how to read animal tracks, when the ice would break, and where the rivers flowed. As centuries passed, these people spread slowly southward. The ice sheets retreated, revealing valleys, forests, lakes, and plains untouched by human hands. The land was generous but dangerous. Rivers flooded without warning. Winters could kill the unprepared. Yet humans adapted. They learned to craft sharper tools from stone, bone, and wood. They learned to control fire not just for warmth, but for cooking, protection, and community. Around fires, stories were told, stories that explained the stars, the animals, and the spirits believed to live within the land itself. Over thousands of years, these early settlers transformed from wandering hunter-gatherers into deeply rooted societies. They learned the seasons. They learned which plants healed and which killed. They learned that cooperation meant survival. Camps became villages. Villages grew into cultures. Each region shaped its people differently. In the frozen north, survival demanded endurance and precision. In the forests, it demanded patience and knowledge of plants and animals. In the open plains, it demanded speed, strategy, and group hunting. In the deserts, it demanded an intimate understanding of water and restraint. There was no single civilization and no single identity. The Americas were a mosaic of peoples, languages, and beliefs. Time flowed differently here. Without written calendars, history was remembered through oral tradition, ceremony, and ritual. The past was alive in songs and dances. Ancestors were not gone, they were present in the land, the wind, the animals, and the stars. Life was not centered on accumulation or domination, but on balance, between humans and nature, between taking and giving, between the living and the unseen. Contrary to the myths that would later be written by outsiders, these societies were not simple or primitive. They were complex in ways that did not resemble European cities but were no less advanced. They built structures aligned with celestial events. They developed agricultural systems suited perfectly to their environments. They traded across vast distances, exchanging tools, shells, obsidian, copper, and ideas. Paths formed between distant communities, slowly becoming trade routes that spanned mountains and rivers. Knowledge traveled with these routes, knowledge of crops, medicine, and beliefs. For tens of thousands of years, the Americas existed in isolation from the rest of the world. Oceans acted as natural barriers, protecting these societies from the endless wars, plagues, and empires rising and falling elsewhere. While civilizations in Europe, Africa, and Asia rose through conquest and collapsed through violence, the peoples of the Americas lived through continuity. Conflict existed, but it was limited, localized, and rarely driven by the desire to dominate entire continents. The land was too vast, and life too fragile, for endless war. Meanwhile, far across the oceans, another world was changing. In Europe, kingdoms rose on the backs of peasants and soldiers. Religion shaped politics, and politics shaped war. Resources were scarce, populations were growing, and rulers dreamed of wealth that could secure their power. Gold became an obsession. Spices became symbols of dominance. Trade routes became reasons for bloodshed. The world beyond the horizon became a temptation too powerful to ignore. Ships grew stronger. Navigation improved. Maps grew more ambitious. Sailors began to believe that the ocean could be crossed, that new lands could be found, and that unimaginable wealth waited on the other side. They did not imagine people living there as equals. They imagined emptiness, or savages, or souls to be claimed. This belief would become one of the most destructive ideas in human history. Unaware of these distant ambitions, life in the Americas continued. Children were born, elders passed on wisdom, seasons turned, and civilizations evolved in their own time. No alarms sounded. No warnings came from the sea. The land remained vast and open, holding millions of lives that had never known invasion, foreign disease, or global conquest. This was the world before America, not a land waiting to be discovered, but a world already full, already alive, already complete. And yet, history was moving toward it. Slowly, land, memory, inevitably, and the shaping of people's generations before the storm had begun. The people who had crossed the frozen land bridge no longer remembered icebound tundra as their only world. The land itself reshaped their identities. Vast grasslands stretched endlessly beneath open skies, later known as the Great Plains, where herds of animals moved like living rivers. Dense forests grew thick along waterways, especially around the winding paths of the Mississippi River, feeding life far beyond its banks. In the southwest, dry lands and deserts demanded patience and discipline, while coastlines offered abundance from the sea. Each environment spoke its own language, and the people who lived there learned to listen. Human survival became less about constant movement and more about understanding place. Seasonal patterns were memorized with precision: when rains would come, when rivers would swell, when animals migrated, when seeds should be planted. Time was measured not in numbers but in signs: the position of the sun, the behavior of birds, the color of leaves, the taste of the wind. Knowledge was sacred because it kept people alive. Elders were valued not for wealth but for memory, carrying lessons earned through decades of observation and hardship. Communities began to develop distinct cultures shaped by geography. In forested regions, people mastered woodworking, crafting canoes, longhouses, and tools designed for hunting among trees. In open plains, mobility and coordination became essential, leading to sophisticated group hunting techniques and social structures based on cooperation. Along rivers and fertile valleys, agriculture slowly emerged, not as a sudden invention but as an evolving relationship with plants. Corn, beans, and squash were cultivated together, each supporting the other, reflecting a worldview built on balance rather than domination. Spiritual beliefs grew directly from the land. Mountains were not obstacles but ancestors. Rivers were living beings with moods and memories. Animals were teachers, each carrying lessons about survival, courage, or restraint. Death was not an ending but a transformation, a return to the natural cycle. These beliefs shaped moral systems, teaching respect, humility, and responsibility to future generations. To harm the land unnecessarily was to harm oneself and one's descendants. Trade networks expanded quietly over centuries. Obsidian from volcanic regions traveled hundreds of miles. Shells from distant coasts appeared far inland. Copper was shaped into tools and ornaments long before European contact. These exchanges were not driven by profit in the modern sense but by relationships. Trade strengthened alliances, spread ideas, and created shared identities across vast distances. News traveled slowly but steadily, carried by travelers who memorized routes and landmarks rather than drawing maps. Despite diversity, a shared principle united many societies: survival through cooperation. Leadership was often earned through wisdom, bravery, or service rather than inherited power. Decisions were discussed collectively, sometimes taking days or weeks, because the consequences affected everyone. Conflict existed, but it was rarely endless. Resources were too precious, and life too fragile, for constant war. Peace, when possible, was a form of strength. While these societies evolved in isolation, the wider world was entering an age of ambition and restlessness. In Europe, power became increasingly centralized. Kings demanded loyalty, land, and labor. Religious authority merged with political ambition, creating justifications for conquest. Wealth became concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority struggled under heavy burdens. Expansion was no longer a choice but a perceived necessity. The idea of lands beyond the sea transformed from myth into obsession. Stories circulated of distant places filled with gold, fertile soil, and limitless opportunity. The ocean, once feared as a boundary, became a challenge to be conquered. Sailors, merchants, and monarchs began to see exploration not as curiosity but as destiny. They believed that reaching new lands would solve their problems at home: poverty, unrest, and rivalry among kingdoms. Yet the people of the Americas knew nothing of these dreams. Their world remained grounded in continuity rather than expansion. Children learned from parents, parents from elders, and elders from the accumulated wisdom of generations. Life moved forward without awareness of the approaching storm. The land continued to give, and the people continued to belong to it. This contrast, between a world built on balance and a world driven by hunger for power, set the stage for one of the most profound turning points in human history. The collision was not immediate, nor was it visible from the shores of either continent. But it was inevitable. The currents of ambition were already moving westward, and the silence of the Americas was about to be broken. Civilizations of the Americas. By the time human societies across the Americas began to settle deeply into their environments, the land no longer felt wild or unknown to them. It was mapped not with ink, but with memory. Paths followed rivers, ridges, and stars. Stories marked boundaries, sacred places, and histories of alliances and conflicts. Over thousands of years, these societies transformed landscapes subtly but powerfully, shaping the world around them while remaining bound to its limits. In the fertile valleys of eastern North America, large agricultural communities emerged. Corn became a foundation of life, carefully cultivated alongside beans and squash in systems that enriched the soil rather than exhausting it. Surplus food allowed populations to grow, villages to expand, and social roles to diversify. Artisans, spiritual leaders, builders, and traders all found places within these societies. Leadership was not absolute, it was negotiated, guided by tradition, and accountable to the community. One of the most remarkable expressions of this development rose near the great rivers of the interior. At its height, the city known today as Cahokia stood as a vast urban center unlike anything else north of Mexico at the time. Earthen mounds towered above the landscape, constructed by human hands over generations. These mounds were not random piles of soil but carefully planned structures aligned with the sun, seasons, and ceremonial life. At its peak, Cahokia supported tens of thousands of people, with neighborhoods, marketplaces, and spiritual centers organized around shared beliefs and authority. Cahokia was not an isolated miracle. It was part of a broader Mississippian world, connected by rivers that served as highways of trade and communication. Ideas, goods, and people moved along these waterways, linking distant communities into a shared cultural sphere. Copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, and stone from distant quarries all found their way into ceremonial objects and tools. These exchanges strengthened relationships and reinforced a sense of belonging to something larger than any single village. Far to the southwest, societies adapted to one of the most challenging environments on the continent. In arid lands where water was scarce, people engineered systems of canals, reservoirs, and terraced fields. The ancestral Puebloan world rose in stone and earth, with multi-story dwellings built into cliffs and mesas. These structures were not merely shelters, they were expressions of community, defense, and spiritual alignment. Architecture reflected an understanding of climate, sunlight, and seasonal change that modern engineers still study with admiration. Life in these regions demanded cooperation at every level. Water had to be shared, fields maintained, and storage carefully managed to survive droughts and unpredictable weather. Social cohesion was not optional, it was essential. Ceremonies marked planting and harvest, reinforcing bonds between people and the land. Spiritual life was woven into daily existence, reminding communities that survival depended not just on skill, but on harmony with forces beyond human control. Along the coasts, entirely different civilizations took shape. Abundant marine resources allowed for stable populations without large-scale agriculture. Fishing, whaling, and gathering supported complex societies with rich artistic traditions. Totem poles, masks, and carvings preserved histories and identities, telling stories of ancestors, spirits, and great events. Wealth in these societies was measured not by land ownership, but by generosity, the ability to give, host, and redistribute resources during ceremonies that reinforced social order. Across the continent, diversity flourished. Languages multiplied into hundreds of distinct families. Political systems ranged from loose bands to confederacies binding many nations together. One such system, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, united multiple nations under principles of shared governance, balance, and consensus. Their political philosophy emphasized long-term thinking, urging leaders to consider the impact of decisions on future generations. This idea, radical even by modern standards, reflected a worldview shaped by continuity rather than conquest. Despite differences, common threads ran through these civilizations. Land was not a commodity to be bought and sold, it was a living presence entrusted to each generation. Wealth was often measured in relationships, knowledge, and spiritual standing rather than accumulation. Power was restrained by tradition and collective responsibility. These values did not make societies peaceful at all times, but they limited the scale and permanence of violence. While these civilizations rose, transformed, and sometimes declined due to environmental change, internal conflict, or shifting trade routes, their histories were not marked by total collapse. Communities adapted, merged, moved, and reformed. Change was gradual, woven into cultural memory rather than imposed through force. The continent remained a dynamic tapestry of human life, resilient and deeply rooted. Unbeknownst to them, forces beyond the horizon were preparing to intrude upon this balance. The civilizations of the Americas had reached a point of complexity and stability that rivaled those elsewhere in the world. Yet they existed without knowledge of the empires, 5,000 words, technologies, the world and ambitions growing across the oceans. The sun rose over a landscape. The meeting of these worlds would not be equal, nor would it be gentle. Towering glaciers crept slowly across valleys, their frozen fingers carving mountains and rivers with an inexorable patience. The winds were cruel, carrying biting frost that could strip warmth from the skin in seconds. Yet, amid this frozen world, humans endured, small bands of them, scattered across continents, bound to survival by ingenuity, courage, and community. Chapter 1, The Frozen Horizon. The early humans of the Ice Age were not the towering mythic figures of legend, they were lean, wiry, and resilient, molded by the harshness of the world. Their homes were temporary shelters of animal hides and bone, erected quickly in response to the shifting climate. Fires were not only warmth but life itself, warding off both predators and the creeping cold. Tora, a young hunter in a tribe near what would one day be called Siberia, knew the rhythms of the snowdrifts. She could read the tracks of a mammoth in the frost, sense the movement of wolves before they were visible, and hear the distant groan of ice as it shifted in the mountains. Her tribe relied on her skill. Without her ability to track and predict, the food supply would dwindle, and death would follow swiftly in the cold. Chapter 2, The Hunt of Giants. Mammoths were both salvation and peril. The tribe's survival depended on hunting these massive creatures, but the act was fraught with danger. Spears tipped with sharpened bone, coordinated strategies, and sheer courage were all that stood between life and a crushing, tusked death. Tora and her companions would drive the mammoths into narrow valleys where the ice made the terrain treacherous, forcing the beasts into traps carefully laid over generations. But hunting was not merely a test of strength, it was a lesson in unity. Every member had a role: the runners who distracted, the diggers who prepared pits, the flint workers who kept weapons sharp. And when the hunt ended successfully, the tribes celebrated not just the meat and hides but the collective triumph over nature itself. Chapter 3, Adaptation and Innovation. The Ice Age forced humans to innovate. Clothing evolved from simple skins into layered protection, stitched and tied with sinew to shield against frostbite. Tools became specialized: needles from bone for sewing, scrapers for preparing hides, and atlatls for propelling spears with deadly speed. Even shelters became ingenious, with snow walls and insulating layers that could withstand blizzards that lasted days. Diet was a matter of survival. Humans scavenged frozen rivers for fish, trapped rabbits and foxes, and followed herds of reindeer across tundra plains. Seasonal migration was critical: no tribe could remain in one place year-round. Knowledge of geography, weather patterns, and animal behavior was passed orally, a living library encoded in stories and songs. Chapter 4, Social Bonds and Rituals. Amid the struggle, humans forged deep social bonds. Families clustered together, sharing food and warmth. Elders taught children the sacred knowledge of survival: which berries were poisonous, which snowdrifts concealed hidden rivers, and which signs in the sky foretold storms. Spirituality emerged as a way to make sense of the vast, threatening world. Carvings of animals, painted on cave walls, were more than art: they were prayers, a dialogue with forces humans could not control. Shamans, recognized for their insight into the unseen, led rituals to ensure the favor of the spirits, asking for successful hunts or protection from disease. Torah's grandmother, the tribe's elder and healer, would trace the constellations on the icy nights, telling the young ones that each star had a story and a lesson for survival. Chapter 5, Conflict and Cooperation. While cooperation was essential, survival sometimes demanded confrontation. Tribes competed for scarce resources: hunting grounds, fresh water, and shelter from the storms. Yet even enemies sometimes exchanged knowledge or goods: a sharp flint blade here, a bundle of dried meat there. Ice Age survival was a delicate balance of competition and collaboration, of guarding what was yours while recognizing the necessity of alliances. Torah once witnessed a tense encounter near a frozen river with a neighboring tribe. Initially, suspicion ran high, weapons raised. But when a wolf attacked, the two tribes fought side by side, demonstrating that survival often demanded unity beyond fear or pride. Chapter 6, Lessons of the Ice. The Ice Age was not merely a period of scarcity and death, it was a crucible that shaped the human spirit. Those who lived learned patience, observation, and the subtlety of timing. A misjudged step could mean a fall into freezing waters, a miscalculated hunt could leave the tribe hungry for weeks. Yet each challenge built resilience. By the time the ice began to recede, humans had mastered survival in ways that would define their civilizations for millennia. They had learned to read the land, understand the animals, innovate for warmth and safety, and forge bonds that transcended immediate survival. The Ice Age, though brutal, had tempered them into a species capable of unimaginable endurance. The chapter closes on a panoramic view: Torah standing atop a ridge, watching the sun glint on icy plains. Her breath forms clouds in the frigid air, but in her eyes shines 5,000 words. The ice had begun to retreat, revealing fertile plains, alive, meandering rivers, and full of stories yet to unfold. Where once humans had wandered as hunters and gatherers, they now paused, observed, and learned to shape the land around them. These were the first stirrings of civilization, a time when survival alone was no longer the goal, but community, trade, culture, and governance began to take root. Chapter 1, Settling the Land. Along the great rivers, Nile, Tigris and Euphrates, Indus, and Yellow River, humans discovered abundance. Water brought life, food, and a constant rhythm to their days. Families who once followed migrating herds now stayed near riverbanks, planting seeds of wheat, barley, and millet. Agriculture became the cornerstone of permanence. People learned to store surplus food, enabling them to weather droughts, floods, or harsh winters. The villages that emerged were small but organized. Mud brick houses lined narrow streets, and storage pits were carefully constructed to protect grain from rodents. Social roles began to diversify, some focused on farming, others on tool-making, pottery, or hunting. Leadership emerged: Not always by force, but often through knowledge. Those who understood irrigation, crop rotation, or animal husbandry were respected and followed. Chapter 2, The Rise of Cities. As populations grew, villages evolved into towns and then cities. Monumental structures began to dominate landscapes, granaries, temples, and walls that signaled permanence and power. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded grain distributions, trade agreements, and the earliest forms of writing. In Egypt, the Nile's predictable flooding allowed pharaohs to organize irrigation systems, control resources, and assert centralized authority. With the city came complexity. Markets bustled with artisans, merchants, and farmers trading goods and ideas. Pottery, textiles, and metalwork flourished. Metallurgy, copper, bronze, and later iron, revolutionized tools and weapons, allowing humans to transform forests, dig canals, and defend territory with unprecedented efficiency. Chapter 3, Knowledge and Culture. The birth of civilization was as much mental as it was physical. Humans began to record stories, laws, and rituals. The first schools were informal, with elders teaching youth about astronomy, mathematics, and the natural world. Writing, once a practical tool for trade and administration, became a vessel for culture, philosophy, and religion. Religion, already present in Ice Age tribes, became more formalized. Temples were built, priests and priestesses performed complex rituals, and myths codified the forces of nature and society into narratives humans could understand and pass on. Kings claimed divine sanction, and monumental art, statues, reliefs, and murals, celebrated gods, rulers, and heroic deeds. Chapter 4, Trade and Network. Civilizations did not exist in isolation. Trade networks emerged, connecting distant cities and regions. Salt, grain, and pottery traveled hundreds of miles. Luxury items like lapis lazuli, gold, and ivory moved even farther. Trade spread not only goods but ideas, techniques, and beliefs. A craftsman in Mesopotamia might learn new pottery designs from a merchant arriving from the Indus Valley. Seeds and plants traveled along rivers and overland routes, while animals, oxen, camels, horses, enhanced transport and agriculture. Civilization was no longer simply survival, it was connection, innovation, and the creation of shared human experience. Chapter 5, Challenges of Organization. With growth came challenges. Cities had to defend themselves from rivals, manage resources, and govern increasingly complex populations. Laws became necessary to maintain order. In Mesopotamia, Hammurabi's code famously codified justice, balancing punishment with societal expectations. In Egypt, pharaohs administered through bureaucracies and appointed officials to oversee taxation, labor, and irrigation. Societies faced disease, famine, and environmental changes. But their ability to plan, collaborate, and innovate allowed them to endure. They learned the value of archives, calendars, and long-term strategies, transforming crises into opportunities for growth. Chapter 6, Legacy of the Early Civilizations. By the end of this era, the world had changed fundamentally. Humans had moved from wandering bands to cities with organized governance, religion, trade, and culture. The rivers that once offered mere sustenance now supported thriving civilizations that would leave indelible marks on history. The seeds of human ingenuity were firmly planted: architecture, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, trade, and governance. These innovations would be passed down, refined, and expanded over millennia, forming the foundation upon which empires would rise and the modern world would eventually emerge. The great rivers shimmered under the sun, and cities hummed with life. In the shadows of the earliest temples, children ran, unaware that they were heirs to a legacy centuries in the making. The age of survival had ended, the age of civilization had begun. Long before empires sprawled across continents, humans had already sensed that the land itself was alive. Mountains, rivers, forests, and celestial bodies were not merely resources, they were sacred, powerful, and imbued with meaning. The birth of civilization was inseparable from belief. Humans did not just inhabit the world, they interpreted it, worshipped it, and sought harmony with forces greater than themselves. Chapter 1, The Sacredness of Nature. For hunter-gatherer tribes emerging from the Ice Age, survival demanded reverence for the natural world. They learned that animals, plants, and rivers were gifts that could be respected, or feared. Certain landscapes became sacred. A high cliff where the wind roared was believed to be the voice of the spirits. A deep lake was a gateway to the underworld. Forest groves served as sanctuaries for rituals and offerings. Torah's granddaughter, Lyra, now living centuries later in a settled river valley, knelt by a spring before dawn. She offered a small bundle of grains and berries to the spirits of water, whispering thanks for the life it gave her people. Sacred sites were often chosen for their natural power: volcanoes, mountain passes, or river confluences. The geography itself became the stage for human spirituality. Chapter 2, Temples and early worship. As villages became cities, belief systems became more structured. The first temples were modest at first, earthen mounds, stone circles, or wooden halls, but their purpose was profound: to house the divine and guide human behavior. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose from river plains, symbolic bridges between humans and gods. In Egypt, the Nile was not merely a river but a manifestation of divine order, its flooding a rhythm of life and death. Priests and priestesses emerged as interpreters of the sacred, guiding rituals, ceremonies, and offerings. They recorded celestial movements, interpreted dreams, and mediated between the people and their gods. Their authority was both spiritual and social, helping maintain order and reinforcing the values of their civilizations. Chapter 3, Myths and Stories. Stories gave shape to belief. Myths explained creation, the cycles of nature, and the mysteries of life and death. In the Fertile Crescent, tales of gods controlling the sun, moon, and fertility reflected the reliance on agriculture. In distant forests of Europe, myths told of spirits guarding trees, rivers, and animals, teaching humans respect for the land. Rituals, dances, and songs carried these myths from one generation to the next. Through them, humans learned their place in the world, not merely as survivors, but as participants in a vast, interconnected cosmos. Chapter 4, Burial and Ancestors. Belief in the sacred extended beyond the living. Burial practices became intricate, reflecting reverence for ancestors and hope for life beyond death. In some regions, the dead were buried with food, tools, or ornaments, symbols of care and preparation for the journey after life. Burial mounds, cairns, and tombs marked not only respect for the deceased but also claimed the land as sacred, anchoring communities to their ancestors. These practices reinforced social cohesion. Families, clans, and tribes were bound by lineage and memory. Respect for ancestors shaped law, morality, and identity, and reinforced the idea that land, life, and spirits were interconnected. Chapter 5, Sacred Landscapes and Power. Sacred spaces were not just spiritual, they held political power. Rulers and priests often claimed divine favor, legitimizing their authority. Monumental temples, tombs, and altars demonstrated wealth, skill, and connection to higher powers. Pilgrimages, festivals, and rituals drew people together, reinforcing social order and shared beliefs. The alignment of structures with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, reflected the fusion of science and religion. The heavens were a calendar, guiding planting, hunting, and ceremonies. Sacred knowledge became knowledge of the world itself. Astronomy, seasons, and geography were intertwined with spiritual life. Chapter 6, The Legacy of Belief. The connection between land and belief endured through centuries. From simple rituals by a spring to towering temples along river valleys, humans learned to see themselves as part of a larger, sacred world. Reverence for nature, the divine, and ancestors shaped behavior, art, and governance. By understanding the sacred, early civilizations created cohesion, identity, and resilience. They left marks on the land, temples, carvings, and ceremonial spaces, that endured long after the individuals who built them had passed. These sacred traditions would echo through time, influencing cultures, religions, and societies across continents. As night fell over the valley, torches flickered in the temples, and Lyra watched the stars reflected in the river. The world was vast, mysterious, and alive, and humans had begun to honor it. The land was sacred, and in that sacredness, civilizations found their soul. Civilizations had been born, and with them arose the engines of human ambition, trade, leadership, and the desire for influence. Where once survival dominated daily life, humans now sought wealth, resources, and prestige. Rivers and roads became arteries of exchange, cities became centers of authority, and the pursuit of power reshaped the landscapes of early societies. Chapter 1, The Birth of Exchange. Humans discovered that surplus was more than security, it was opportunity. Farmers produced more grain than their families could consume. Artisans crafted pottery, textiles, and metal tools beyond local demand. This surplus allowed the first systems of trade to develop. Markets became hubs of interaction. Merchants traveled long distances, exchanging grain for salt, copper for gold, and pottery for livestock. Trade was not merely economic, it was cultural. Stories, ideas, religious practices, and technological innovations traveled with goods. In a bustling Mesopotamian marketplace, merchants haggled over jars of oil while scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets. A caravan arriving from the distant mountains brought copper, precious stones, and tales of other lands. Through trade, humans glimpsed worlds beyond their villages and began to weave a web of connections that spanned continents. Chapter 2, The Power of Resources. Control over resources became power itself. Regions rich in fertile land, minerals, or strategic rivers gained influence over neighboring territories. Kings and chiefs recognized that authority depended on more than force, it depended on wealth, distribution, and loyalty. In the Nile Valley, pharaohs organized vast grain stores to feed cities, armies, and workers building monumental temples. In Mesopotamia, city-states competed fiercely for control of irrigation networks, trade routes, and fertile plains. Leaders who managed resources effectively commanded respect and loyalty, those who failed risked rebellion or conquest. Chapter 3, Diplomacy and Alliances. Trade and power demanded diplomacy. Early civilizations negotiated treaties, alliances, and marriages to secure peace and access to resources. Envoys carried gifts, symbols of goodwill, and the promise of cooperation. Sometimes, alliances were fragile. City-states squabbled over boundaries, rivers, or trade rights. Yet even in conflict, commerce continued. Goods could flow across enemy lands under temporary truces, and knowledge traveled despite political rivalry. The balance between cooperation and competition shaped the political landscape. Chapter 4, Technology and Transport. The expansion of trade relied on technological innovation. Boats plied rivers and coasts, connecting distant settlements. Roads and paths facilitated overland travel, while animals, oxen, donkeys, camels, enabled larger cargo loads. Metallurgy advanced both production and warfare. Bronze and iron tools increased agricultural efficiency, while weapons allowed armies to protect trade routes or expand territories. Storage techniques, granaries, clay jars, and sealed warehouses ensured that surpluses could travel long distances without spoiling. Maps and rudimentary writing became essential. Merchants recorded routes, quantities, and contracts. Knowledge was power. A trader who knew distant markets held an advantage, just as a ruler who understood geography and resources could consolidate authority. Chapter 5, Social Hierarchies and Governance. Trade and resource management created social stratification. Kings, priests, and merchants accumulated wealth and influence. Farmers, laborers, and artisans often remained dependent on the elites. Social hierarchies were justified by religion, tradition, or force. In many cities, governance became formalized. Bureaucracies managed taxes, grain distribution, and labor for public works. Laws codified property rights and trade regulations. Power was no longer simply inherited, it was administered, recorded, and defended through a combination of authority, wealth, and strategy. Chapter 6, Conflict and Conquest. Where there was wealth, there was conflict. City-states and kingdoms waged wars over land, water, and trade routes. Armies carried not only weapons but siege technologies, strategic planning, and diplomacy, yet conquest often served commerce. New territories brought resources, new markets, and labor. The cycle of trade, power, and expansion created a dynamic world in which survival alone was no longer sufficient. Ambition drove societies to grow, dominate, and influence others. Chapter 7, Legacy of Trade and Power. By the end of this era, human civilizations had established networks that connected distant lands, hierarchies that structured society, and political systems that managed resources. Trade enriched cities, enabled cultural exchange, and spread ideas, while power organized labor, defended resources, and shaped governance. The foundations laid during this period, commerce, technology, diplomacy, and social organization, would endure for millennia. Human ambition, driven by the desire for wealth and influence, transformed the world from scattered settlements into complex, interconnected civilizations. As merchants unloaded goods along riverbanks and scribes etched transactions into clay, the stage was set for an even greater awakening, the civilizations of Europe and the rising hunger for distant riches that would one day reshape the globe. While civilizations thrived along the great rivers of Africa and Asia, Europe stirred slowly from its Ice Age isolation. The continent, shaped by glaciers and forests, had once been harsh and unforgiving. Now, fertile plains, rivers, and the temperate climate invited new possibilities. Small communities evolved into organized societies, crafting culture, governance, and trade networks that would eventually reshape the world. Chapter 1. From tribes to chiefdoms. For millennia, Europe had been home to hunter-gatherer tribes, surviving in small, mobile bands. With the retreat of the glaciers, these groups began to settle near fertile river valleys, lakes, and coasts. Agriculture allowed for permanent settlements, and with permanence came hierarchy. Chiefs and elders led clans, coordinating hunting, defense, and resource management. Leadership was often earned through wisdom, bravery, or control over surplus food and goods. Tribes began to communicate, forming alliances or rivalries, and laying the groundwork for larger political structures. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, villages grew into proto-cities, surrounded by wooden palisades and ditches for protection. Trade began to connect communities, exchanging grains, livestock, tools, and crafted goods. Europe, long isolated, was slowly awakening to the possibilities of organized society. Chapter 2, Agricultural Revolution. The adoption of agriculture transformed Europe. Barley, wheat, rye, and legumes were cultivated systematically, while domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, and pigs, provided meat, milk, and labor. Seasonal cycles dictated daily life, and storage techniques preserved food through harsh winters. The Neolithic period saw the rise of monumental constructions, like stone circles and burial mounds. These structures were not only spiritual but also social, reflecting growing organization and coordination. Communities developed shared rituals, festivals, and symbols, fostering identity and cohesion across regions. Chapter 3, Trade and Cultural Exchange. Trade became a force for connection and innovation. Coastal communities exchanged fish, salt, and pottery. Inland settlements traded metals, timber, and textiles. Bronze, and later iron, transformed tools, weapons, and art. Artisans specialized in crafting, while knowledge of navigation, metallurgy, and agriculture spread across the continent. Cultural exchange also carried beliefs, myths, and symbols. Shared artistic styles appeared across regions, indicating interconnected communities. Europe's awakening was both economic and intellectual. Ideas traveled alongside goods, linking peoples over vast distances. Chapter 4, Spiritual Life and Rituals. Europeans continued to honor sacred landscapes. Rivers, mountains, and groves were believed to hold spirits and divine power. Stone circles, like those that would later inspire Stonehenge, aligned with celestial events, marking solstices and equinoxes. Rituals, offerings, and communal gatherings reinforced bonds and established moral and social order. Spiritual leaders, shamans, priests, or elders, mediated between the community and the natural world, guiding hunts, agricultural practices, and celebrations. Religion was inseparable from daily life, shaping work, play, and governance. Chapter 5, Emergence of cities and governance. By the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, small settlements coalesced into larger towns. Fortifications, storage facilities, and workshops indicated growing complexity. Leaders exercised control over resources and trade, laying the foundation for governance structures. Europe's political awakening was gradual. Authority often rested on consensus, ritual, or the ability to protect and provide. Yet these early forms of governance allowed communities to coordinate larger projects, irrigation, roads, fortifications, that strengthened social cohesion and enhanced survival. Chapter 6, Conflict and Competition. Wherever resources were concentrated, conflict followed. Tribes clashed over fertile land, grazing grounds, or river access. Yet competition also drove innovation. Fortifications grew stronger, weapons became more effective, and strategies more sophisticated. At the same time, alliances and marriages created networks of influence across regions. Trade and diplomacy were as important as warfare, and Europe's awakening involved a delicate balance of cooperation and conflict. Chapter 7, Seeds of Future Europe. By the end of this era, Europe had begun to take shape as a continent of organized communities, connected by trade, shared culture, and emerging governance. Agriculture, metallurgy, spirituality, and social hierarchies laid the foundations for kingdoms and empires that would dominate the millennia to come. Rivers glistened under the sun, towns buzzed with activity, and stone monuments marked both sacred and civic life. Europe was no longer a land of isolated tribes, it had awakened, poised on the brink of history, ready to join the broader currents of human civilization. As Europe awakened, the appetite for wealth and influence began to grow. Gold, silver, and other precious resources were no longer mere curiosities, they were symbols of power, prestige, and security. This hunger would ignite a drive that reshaped societies, propelled exploration, and eventually brought distant continents into contact. Chapter 1, The allure of precious metals. Gold and silver were prized across Europe, valued not only for their beauty but for their rarity and stability. Chiefs, kings, and elites hoarded these metals as a display of wealth and authority. Jewelry, ceremonial items, and coinage became tangible signs of status. Mining communities developed in resource-rich regions, often under the control of local rulers. Miners worked long hours extracting ore, while artisans transformed it into objects that combined artistry with power. Gold was more than a material, it was a medium through which society expressed hierarchy, religion, and ambition. Chapter 2, Trade routes and distant lands. The desire for precious metals drove trade far beyond local boundaries. Caravans traversed mountains, rivers, and seas, connecting Europe to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Luxury goods, spices, gems, and textiles arrived alongside metals, feeding Europe's fascination with distant lands. Merchants became influential figures. Their knowledge of routes, foreign customs, and currencies allowed them to navigate both trade and diplomacy. European settlements began to consolidate near rivers, coasts, and resource-rich areas, turning towns into centers of commerce and opportunity. Chapter 3, Conquest and Competition. Hunger for gold intensified competition. Kingdoms and city-states sought to dominate mines, trade routes, and fertile territories. Wars were waged not only for land but for control of wealth that could finance armies, construct monuments, and strengthen political power. Exploration also began to take root. Seafarers and adventurers sought rivers, coastlines, and islands rumored to contain riches. Navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography advanced as Europe's eyes turned beyond familiar borders, eager to claim resources that promised power and prestige. Chapter 4, Cultural and Religious Drivers. The pursuit of wealth was intertwined with culture and belief. Gold and silver were often offered to gods, incorporated into religious artifacts, and used to fund temples, shrines, and rituals. Kings and elites justified their pursuit of riches as part of divine favor, linking material ambition with spiritual sanction. Myths and legends of faraway lands, filled with gold, precious stones, and exotic spices, spread across Europe, inspiring adventurers and fueling collective imagination. These stories blurred the line between reality and aspiration, creating a hunger that extended far beyond immediate survival or local power. Chapter 5, Foundations of Global Expansion. Europe's growing appetite for wealth and influence set the stage for exploration and expansion. The desire for gold drove technological innovation in navigation, shipbuilding, and mapping. Societies invested in learning, science, and logistics to reach resources previously inaccessible. Simultaneously, social structures adapted. Merchant classes gained prominence, kings centralized authority, and states increasingly coordinated exploration and trade. The pursuit of wealth was no longer individual, it became national, with consequences that would ripple across continents. Chapter 6. Consequences of the Gold Hunt. The hunger for gold reshaped Europe internally and externally. Economically, it created specialized labor, expanded trade networks, and encouraged urban growth. Politically, it fueled centralization of power, rivalry between states, and early forms of diplomacy, yet the pursuit of wealth also sowed seeds of conflict, inequality, and exploitation. The drive for precious metals would eventually push Europeans into lands far beyond their own, encountering civilizations previously unknown. The ambitions born in this era would reverberate for centuries, driving conquest, colonization, and cultural exchange on a global scale. Chapter 7. Europe poised for the world. By the end of this era, Europe had transformed from a continent of scattered communities into one driven by curiosity, ambition, and the pursuit of wealth. Gold, silver, and luxury goods had become catalysts for exploration, trade, and competition. Rivers glinted with merchant ships, towns buzzed with trade, and kings plotted to expand their influence. Europe was ready to reach outward, and the stage was set for the age of maritime discovery, a time when hunger for gold would lead humanity to the edges of the known world. As Europe's hunger for wealth, resources, and knowledge intensified, the seas emerged as the next frontier. Rivers and coastal trade alone could not satisfy ambition. Humans needed ships, charts, and new methods of navigation. Ships became instruments of power, tools of commerce, and symbols of human ingenuity, opening paths to lands previously unreachable. Chapter 1. Early maritime innovations. Early European societies had long used rivers, lakes, and coastlines for transportation. Simple boats of hollowed logs, reeds, or planks allowed fishermen and traders to travel short distances. But as ambitions grew, so did the need for stronger, larger, and more seaworthy vessels. Shipbuilders experimented with new designs, planked hulls for stability, keels for balance, and sails to harness wind power. Oar-driven vessels evolved into ships capable of long voyages, carrying cargo and people farther than ever before. Each improvement brought greater efficiency, safety, and range, and the knowledge spread through maritime communities. Chapter 2. Navigation and knowledge. Navigating open waters required more than skillful rowing or sailing. Humans began to observe the stars, sun, and wind patterns to guide journeys. Early compasses, maps, and charts gradually emerged, turning intuition into science. Mariners learned to read currents, tides, and coastal landmarks, building mental maps that allowed exploration beyond familiar shores. In port towns, knowledge was shared and traded. Experienced sailors passed techniques to apprentices. Merchants relied on navigators to reach distant markets safely. By combining observation, memory, and innovation, Europeans turned the unknown seas into a domain they could master. Chapter 3. Coastal trade and exploration. Before crossing oceans, Europeans expanded along coastlines. Ships transported timber, salt, wine, and other goods between settlements, strengthening trade networks and urban centers. Mariners also scouted harbors, islands, and river mouths, creating routes that would later support long-distance voyages. Exploration was not just economic, it was cultural. Sailors documented strange lands, unfamiliar flora and fauna, and new peoples. These observations, recorded in journals and maps, became invaluable knowledge for future generations, fueling curiosity and ambition. Chapter 4. The role of technology. Technological advances accelerated Europe's maritime power. Sail designs improved speed and maneuverability, while hull construction allowed for heavier cargo. The development of rudders and better anchors enhanced control. Tools like astrolabes, compasses, and quadrant instruments enabled precise navigation, extending voyages into previously uncharted waters. Shipyards became centers of innovation. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, and metallurgists collaborated to design vessels capable of withstanding storms, carrying valuable cargo, and supporting larger crews. Maritime technology became a cornerstone of European influence and expansion. Chapter 5. Maritime power and politics. Control of the seas became a measure of political strength. Coastal kingdoms and city-states invested in fleets to protect trade, enforce authority, and project power. Naval strength determined the ability to dominate trade routes, secure resources, and expand influence. Maritime competition fueled diplomacy, alliances, and conflicts. Port cities became strategic hubs where merchants, explorers, and rulers intersected. Control of navigation knowledge was as valuable as control of gold, and those who mastered both could reshape the balance of power. Chapter 6. Cultural exchange across water. Ships connected not only goods but ideas, religion, and culture. Maritime trade brought foreign technologies, artistic styles, and philosophies to European shores. Sailors returned with stories of distant peoples, strange customs, and exotic materials, expanding the collective imagination and knowledge of Europe. Maritime routes created networks that would later underpin global exploration. Knowledge of winds, tides, and coastal landmarks formed the foundation for transoceanic voyages, linking ambition with capability. Chapter 7. Preparing for the world. By the end of this era, Europe had become a continent of navigators, shipbuilders, and traders. Rivers, coasts, and seas were pathways to wealth, power, and discovery. The combination of maritime technology, navigational skill, and ambition set the stage for voyages to distant continents, eventually crossing oceans that had once seemed impassable. Europe stood ready at the edge of the known world, poised to transform ambition into action. Ships and navigation had turned the dream of distant lands into a tangible reality, and the horizon was filled with possibilities waiting to be explored. Europe, Asia, and Africa had matured into complex civilizations, with trade, technology, and maritime skill at their peaks. Yet a new horizon beckoned, lands and peoples that remained unknown, vast oceans that promised both peril and opportunity. Humanity was poised on the edge of contact, a time when curiosity, ambition, and commerce would push societies to confront the wider world. Chapter 1. Curiosity and rumors. Merchants, sailors, and explorers brought back stories of distant lands, islands with unfamiliar plants and animals, coasts rich in resources, and peoples with strange customs. Rumors traveled slowly at first, carried along trade routes, from caravan to port city, from market to royal court. Legends of lands beyond the sea stirred imaginations. Sailors told tales of golden rivers, fertile islands, and peoples who lived without kings. Scholars debated the credibility of these accounts, while rulers saw opportunity, new wealth, strategic advantage, and potential allies. The edge of the known world became both a source of wonder and a challenge to human ambition. Chapter 2. Early exploration. Europeans and others began to explore systematically. Coastal surveys, long-distance voyages along familiar waters, and experiments with navigation extended the boundaries of knowledge. Ships carried not only cargo but scouts, mapmakers, and chroniclers. Exploration required courage and endurance. Storms, unknown currents, and treacherous coasts tested human skill and resilience. Each journey, whether successful or disastrous, expanded maps, refined techniques, and prepared civilizations for contact with lands beyond familiar seas. Chapter 3. Cross-cultural encounters. Trade and early exploration brought tentative contact with distant cultures. Merchants exchanged goods, artisans shared techniques, and travelers documented languages, rituals, and customs. Some encounters were peaceful, creating networks of exchange that enriched both sides. Others were tense, as misunderstandings or competition over resources sparked conflict. These early interactions emphasized human adaptability. Diplomacy, negotiation, and observation became essential. Cultures learned to interpret gestures, trade practices, and social norms, forming the first steps of true intercultural communication. Chapter 4. Technological foundations. The edge of contact was made possible by accumulated technological and intellectual advances. Ships could endure longer voyages, navigation relied on celestial observation, rudimentary compasses, and coastal landmarks. Cartography advanced rapidly, turning fragmented knowledge into usable maps. Weaponry and defense mechanisms allowed explorers and traders to protect themselves. Metallurgy, textiles, and stored food sustained crews on voyages that could last weeks or months. The combination of technology and human ingenuity transformed curiosity into practical exploration. Chapter 5. Economic and political incentives. Exploration was fueled by ambition. Rulers sought new sources of wealth, precious metals, spices, timber, and exotic goods. Merchants envisioned profitable trade networks reaching distant markets. Cities and states competed for influence, using naval power, alliances, and diplomacy to secure routes and resources. Economic and political incentives intertwined with cultural and religious motives. Pilgrimages, missionary work, and the desire to expand influence often accompanied voyages, creating a complex mix of ambition, belief, and commerce. Chapter 6. Preparing for global contact. By the end of this period, civilizations were ready for unprecedented interaction. Maps grew more accurate, fleets more reliable, and knowledge of the world's oceans expanded. Europe stood at the threshold of crossing into unknown lands, while Asia and Africa maintained networks connecting continents and peoples. The stage was set for contact that would reshape human history. Cultures, economies, and ecosystems that had evolved in isolation would soon meet, exchanging ideas, technologies, goods, and people. Humanity had reached the edge, poised to step into a truly global age. Chapter 7. Legacy of the Edge. The era of the edge of contact left enduring marks. Knowledge of navigation, trade, and diplomacy became invaluable. Societies that embraced exploration gained advantage in commerce and influence. Curiosity, courage, and adaptability were celebrated, creating a legacy that would carry explorers across oceans and continents. Rivers, coasts, and ports hummed with preparation. Ships were fitted, crews trained, and maps refined. The horizon no longer represented emptiness, it promised discovery, challenge, and transformation. The world was about to become interconnected in ways humanity had never imagined, and those who dared to reach beyond the familiar would shape the centuries to come.